Bom dia a todos, a todas. Nós damos as boas-vindas ao professor Kelly James Clark. Temos esta oportunidade, não é, de nos encontrarmos também com o professor Sérgio, da UFOP, que está o professor Marco Heleno. Nós estamos promovendo juntos, não é, esse evento com esta conferência do professor Clark. Então, nós vamos fazer o seguinte, nós vamos ter esse momento de conferência, o professor vai se expressar em inglês e nós vamos passar a tradução aqui na tela, certo? Vai ser feito dessa forma. Eu vou fazer a apresentação do professor e depois eu combinei com ele que eu ia explicar 3 termos, porque nós tivemos dificuldade de traduzir e eles podem gerar mal-entendido, certo? Então, e aí depois vem a conferência do professor. Então, o professor Kelly James Clark, da Universidade de Notre Dame, é pesquisador sênior em filosofia da religião, quer dizer, um pesquisador altamente experimentado, né, na área de filosofia da religião, associado ao Kaufman Interfaith Institute da Grand Valley State University. Então, isso aqui traduzindo daria Instituto de Interfé ou Intercrença, não é? Interreligioso Kaufman. Então, o Kelly foi professor visitante na Universidade de Oxford, na Universidade de St. Andrews e na Universidade de Notre Dame. São grandes universidades, né? E ele é autor e co-editor, editor de mais de 20 livros e vários artigos, incluindo Abraham's Children, Liberty and Tolerance in an Age of Religious Conflict. Os filhos de Abraão, liberdade e tolerância numa idade de conflito, numa era de conflitos religiosos. Religion and Science of Origins, Religião e Ciência das Origens. Return to Reason, um retorno à razão. The Story of Ethics, a história da ética. E, finalmente, When Faith is Not Sufficient, quando a fé não é suficiente. Ele tem falado, não é, escrito amplamente sobre compaixão, tolerância e paz. Então, 3 conceitos, não é, que nos interessam vivamente. Então, como eu havia prometido, eu vou apenas definir para vocês, queria que vocês gravassem bem isso, para não gerar confusão. O professor vai usar 3 conceitos com os quais a gente não está, talvez, muito habituado. Um é o conceito de inferência, inference. Então, o que é esse conceito de inferência na palestra dele? Significa o seguinte: a gente tem uma crença baseada em evidências, certo? Então, a ideia é que a ideia de inferência, aqui no texto dele, é uma ideia bem ampla, não é simplesmente uma questão lógica, não é? Mas as nossas crenças, crença no sentido bem amplo, não é? Aquilo em que a gente sabe que é assim, né? Baseado em evidências. O segundo conceito importante é mentalização. Então, esse a gente tem que explicar, porque é um conceito raro na nossa literatura, né? Não significa meditação, alguma coisa assim. Mentalização é a nossa capacidade ou habilidade, né, de compreender o comportamento próprio de outra pessoa como tendo intenções. Ou seja, a gente olha para a pessoa e a gente sabe, ela está irritada comigo, não, ela quer me ajudar, não é? Então, a gente vê a pessoa como um ser de interioridade. Tá? Então, isso aqui é o que ele chama de mentalização. E limites de mentalização não são limites mentais, não. Quer dizer que a pessoa não é capaz de olhar para a outra e perceber o que a outra está sentindo. o que a outra está pensando, o que a outra está desejando, certo? Não tem essa capacidade. E o último conceitozinho é neurotípico. Não é neurótico, neurotípico. Né? Neurotípico quer dizer uma pessoa que não é autista, que não tem problema de Alzheimer, ou seja, que não foge dos padrões de comportamento e pensamento. Tá? Então, são esses 3 conceitos para evitar algum mal-entendido. So, very well, Professor. I'm very sorry to take your time with these explanations, but I thought that would be good. So, we are here to listen your talk. Yes.
Can you translate for me?
Okay.
Hey, I want to thank FAJE for the invitation to come and speak. It's a beautiful campus, and I'm glad to be here.
Agradeço a FAJE pela invitação, o convite, né, para estar aqui e falar com vocês. É um lindo campus, né, e muito agradável.
But I'm confused. I know this is a Jesuit campus, and Jesuits are famous for being very loving, but I don't feel the love. Everybody is way back there.
Eu estou um pouco confuso, porque os jesuítas são conhecidos por serem pessoas muito amáveis, mas eu não estou me sentindo essa amabilidade, porque vocês estão todos no fundo. Será que vocês poderiam chegar para frente?
So I want everyone to do me a favor. I want you to come up here. I'm going to take a selfie with the group. I like to record my visits. Come on. No, you have to get up and come down. Come down here. I'm going to take a
então,
selfie.
Ele pede a vocês que venham para frente para a gente se sentir mais...
Come on, you guys in the back. Come on.
Por favor.
Come on. No back rows. Everyone come here. I have to take a selfie first.
Ele quer tirar uma foto com vocês.
Come here in the middle. I have to take a selfie first. Come on.
Oi?
No, come in this aisle. Come on, I have to take a selfie. Will you stand here with me? Come here. Right here. There we go. Okay, everyone else, keep coming over here. I need to take a selfie. I got to get everybody in. Come on. Keep coming. We have 2, 3. Here we go. Come on. Come on. I have to get a selfie. Nice to meet you too. Come on, I need everybody for the selfie. Keep it coming. A few more. Come on, act like you like me. Come on. We need some women in the picture. I know there are women here. We need women theologians. The world needs women theologians. Keep coming. Come, selfie people. Okay, I'm taking it this way. I don't see everybody. Who knows how to... I know you... Everyone does this better than I do. Come on.
Okay. Very nice. Good.
Oh, I'm feeling the love now. Thanks.
Eu me sinto mais amado agora. Obrigado.
I don't usually read papers. I think reading papers can be boring, but I know not everyone speaks English. So you can follow along. I'll try to read slowly and clearly. And then there'll be time at the end for questions. Philosophers could save a lot of time by taking their cues from the news. Recent headlines proclaim that science has demonstrated the rationality of unbelief and the irrationality of belief. Logic squashes religious belief, a new study finds. The venerable Scientific American proclaimed, losing your religion. Analytic thinking can undermine belief. And then there's the alleged connection between high IQ and atheism. And while God may run in our genes, unbelief, so it is claimed, is the exclusive province of the intelligent. The Guardian, one of England's most famous newspapers, trumpeted atheists more intelligent than religious believers, says new study. While the Independent, another major British newspaper, preferred the converse, religious people are less intelligent than atheists. And in the veritable medical daily, we read, proved, atheists more intelligent than religious people. In this talk, I will examine some of the cognitive underpinnings of atheism. While the cognitive science of religion is well-trodden ground, atheism has been considerably less scrutinized. I suspect this is due to the following. The vast majority of those who work on these topics are atheists or agnostics who view religious belief as false, outdated, and even bizarre. Given this assumption, the project of socio-psychological critiques of religion is to explain how otherwise rational people could hold obviously false beliefs. Unlike religious belief, their own beliefs, agnosticism or atheism, so the narrative goes, are products of cool, rational reflection, the triumph of reason over superstition. The project then is to seek out the malfunction that produces religious beliefs. Atheism gets a free pass. There's no lack of anecdotal evidence to support this narrative. Many cognitive scientists whose work seems in principle neutral with respect to the truth of religious belief betray a firm belief in the rational superiority of atheism. A cursory glance at various practitioners' conceptions of religion reveals their stance. Religion is patently improbable and factually impossible. This is from Scott Atran, one of the pioneers in cognitive science of religion. Pascal Boyer says religion is an airy nothing. One might not have thought that there were so many ways of saying false. What could lead the human mind, they think, to entertain and accommodate obviously false beliefs? Given the pathetic absurdity yet superabundance of God beliefs, non-truth tracking, belief-producing mechanisms must be the culprit. With the discovery of these ignoble cognitive causes, religious belief can be finally unmasked as the irrational folly we all know it is. Atheism, on the other hand, is not the product of ignoble causes. It is the result of reflection on reasons. Religious belief is debunked because it is produced by a non-truth conducive psychological cause, whereas unbelief is rational because it is based on rational reflection and good reasons. In this talk, I'll consider claims that suggest that atheism is a virtuous intellectual achievement, that atheists are smarter, atheists are more inferential, etc., whereas theism is intellectually suspect. And then we'll consider various cognitive defects that are correlated with atheism. I'll ask at various points along the way, what follows about atheism and theism alike from these fascinating studies? Finally, I will argue that despite claims to the contrary, and for atheism's intellectual superiority, atheism is not normal in its most basic statistical sense. Theism is normal. And yet I will conclude that nothing of epistemic significance follows. Atheism and IQ. In their essay, Average Intelligence Predicts Atheism Rates Across 137 Nations, Richard Lynn's team's analysis of many individual studies shows that intelligent people tend to be less likely to believe in God. The data come in many shapes and sizes. For example, in Western societies, high IQ correlates with low belief in God. And scientific elites are considerably less likely to believe. As children grow up and grow in intelligence, they are less likely to believe. During the 20th century, as IQ has increased, religious belief has declined. Finally, nations with higher average IQ have higher numbers of atheists. Lynn says that one factor alone explains atheism. I believe it is simply a matter of the IQ. While there is some reason to doubt the correlation between higher intelligence and a tendency toward unbelief, even supposing it is true, the question remains, what is the most plausible explanation of the correlation between high IQ and unbelief? Does IQ turn people into atheists? Some atheists have taken this correlation to confirm the triumph of reason over superstition. The atheist is comforted. Atheists are smarter, more analytic, more rational, more evidence sensitive, more truth concerned than theists. But has Lynn really established the higher intelligence is the driver of unbelief? Suppose there is a correlation between atheism and high IQ. Would the correlation between intelligence and unbelief show that intellectual reflection on the evidence was the cause of unbelief? There are other possible and even more plausible explanations of the data. The most plausible theory suggests that the common cause of both higher IQ and unbelief is increased socioeconomic status. We know this much to be true. IQ levels increase as material wealth increases. And with the US as a notable exception, belief in God decreased in Western nations as material wealth increased. Moreover, within nations, those who are higher up socioeconomically likewise tend toward unbelief. If there are existential urges to religious belief, ones exacerbated by, for example, starvation, sickness, and death, then societies that can satisfy those urges through economic advances are likely to see a decline in religious belief. And as health and access to education improve, they're also likely to see a corresponding rise in IQ. Rational reflection is absent from this explanation of unbelief. Lynn's paper considers this a possibility, but then ignores it. As Phil Zuckerman writes, one leading theory comes from Norris and Engelhardt, who argue that in societies characterized by plentiful food distribution, excellent public health care, and widely accessible housing, religiosity wanes. Conversely, in societies whose food and shelter are scarce and life is generally less secure, religious belief is strong. The satisfaction of social needs, not critical reflection on the existence of God, is the best attested explanation of religious unbelief in modern society. If Zuckerman is right, both atheism and theism are mediated by the relief of existential anxiety. Since relieving existential anxiety is not truth conducive, the atheist is not in a rationally privileged position over the theist. What about the decided lack of belief in God among academics in general and highly accomplished scientists in particular? Should Should that worry us? According to Lynn, only 7% of members of the American National Academy of Sciences believe in God, and only 3.3% of the fellows of the Royal Society believe in God. Lynn claims that such high IQ people, as they grow up and reflect on religious belief, slide into doubt and unbelief. Isn't that good evidence that high IQ, which Lynn takes as shorthand for people with highly educated critical skills who deeply reflect on all of their beliefs, not just their scientific ones, produces reflective unbelief? Once again, correlation does not prove cause. There may be underlying biases that non-reflectively incline academics to unbelief. Since biases are often unconsciously activated, later on, though, when considering the beliefs produced by biases, we offer up a rational justification for that belief and sincerely assume that we acquired the belief on the basis of those good reasons. Although academics fancy themselves immune to the normal psychological biases that affect everyone else, they are not immune to such biases. Let me suggest one bias that likely affects the prevalence of atheism in the academy, and that bias is conformity bias. If you find yourself in Rome doing as the Romans do, say sipping a late night espresso after eating a delicious gelato, you have probably succumbed to the conformity bias. Humans have a powerful, innate, and subtle tendency to conform to social norms. Probably no surprise here, we subconsciously conform to, for example, various beauty standards, including the latest fashions in clothing or hairstyle. We don't typically self-consciously choose to conform, just as we don't typically decide what's beautiful or cool. Our culture tells us what is beautiful and cool, and we unconsciously, unself-consciously exceed. When we're at the store, we simply find ourselves coveting that new style, coveting that new style of sweater or the latest cell phone, even to the point of buying them. While conformity usually affects behaviors, we also conform with respect to beliefs. Through a series of studies, Solomon Asch showed how difficult it is for an individual to maintain her own belief in the midst of a group that expresses a contrary belief. In one experiment, subjects were shown a picture of a target line with an array of lines of 3 different sizes. So it's a picture of just 3 lines. That's all they saw. And the lines were different sizes, and they were identified as A, B, or C. And then the experimenter asked which of these 3 lines was the same length as the target line. This simple perceptual task had an obviously correct and easily verifiable answer, say C. So it was obvious that C was the right answer. It wasn't a trick, which the subject would choose correctly. However, when all of the members of the group insisted that the correct answer was, say, A, 75% of the subjects changed their belief. Remember, from the obvious answer, the obviously correct answer, C, they changed it to the wrong answer. Conformity increases when the issues involved in conformity increases when the issue involved is less obvious, and when other members of the group are of a higher socioeconomic status. When individuals view the others in the group as more powerful, influential, or knowledgeable than themselves, they are more likely to conform to the beliefs of the group. We find precisely this situation in the academy. If the majority in a highly desirable group holds certain views or manifests certain practices, then you should expect aspiring candidates for that group to mimic their beliefs and practices. And if the majority of the scientific community is atheist or agnostic, then you should expect to find belief conformity, probably better, unbelief conformity. Those who aspire to be a member of that community will find themselves mimicking the unbelief of the majority on the basis of acceding to this conformity, this disposition, and not based on rational reflection. The cognitive science of religion does not claim that everyone is inclined to a faith that they would die for. It only claims that given certain cultural influences or the environmental or other environmental influences, people are inclined to acquire and maintain religious beliefs. Religious belief may be widespread and in many cases skin deep. So many people might be inclined due to other cognitive dispositions in the face of other cultural or environmental influences to unbelief. Believer and unbeliever alike may have acquired their religious belief or unbelief through a non-reflective, non-truth conducive cognitive process, not on the basis of rational reflection. The social pressures against religious belief in academia are not insubstantial. A prominent philosopher friend was an adult convert to Christianity. He kept his convictions mostly private, and he never referred to them in his scholarly work or during presentations. When word of his conversion leaked out, he was routinely asked by colleagues at meals or even during public presentations if the stories of his conversion were true. And this was usually followed by a snide comment asking how he could believe something so ludicrous. His colleagues in the audience would laugh as he did his best to offer a meager response. Imagine the effect of the public derision of this scholar's religious beliefs on students or younger academics. They got the message. Recall the correlation between high IQ and unbelief. Academics have considerably higher IQs on average than the general public. And academics are considerably more likely to be atheists or agnostics. Is this correlation due to smartness on the part of the group? If I'm right, a major contributor to unbelief in the academy is not intelligence. Rather, unbelief is a result of the unconscious urge to conform. Academics, of course, won't think that their religious unbelief is due to an unconscious psychic urge. You can hear the theist to an atheist scholar, if they were like Richard Dawkins, you just reject belief in God because you wanted so desperately to be accepted by your group. But nobody thinks that their beliefs are based on unconscious psychic urges. And yet, many of our beliefs are. And yet we are all, academic and non-academic, high and low IQ, susceptible to unconscious psychological urges. None of us is immune from biases, including the drive to conform. Let me provide one more example of conformity bias in the academy, which might lend some credence to my claim about religious belief. A 2010 study showed a correlation between political liberalism and high IQ on the one hand, and political conservatism and considerably lower IQ on the other hand. It found that liberals' average IQ score is 106.42, whereas conservatives' average score is 94.82. Are liberals then smarter than conservatives? Is liberalism thereby more likely to be true? A recent survey suggests that only 11.5% of university faculty identify as politically conservative, whereas 62% identify as politically liberal or the far left. If a disproportionate number of university professors are politically liberal, then a disproportionate number of high IQs are going to skew politically liberal. What is the best explanation of political liberalism in the academy? Careful and reasoned assessments of the arguments pro and con? I doubt it, and for two reasons. A, arguments in political philosophy are not sufficiently compelling to expect rational consensus in favor of political liberalism or conservatism. And B, most academics don't spend their time carefully assessing arguments in political philosophy. They just do their biology or anthropology or French literature. What might contribute then to the predominance of political liberalism in the academy? Most likely, conformity and prestige bias, with some hiring bias thrown in. If most professors are liberal, IQ scores will skew toward the liberal, but not for truth-conducive reasons. Moreover, if a disproportionate number of professors are politically liberal, then their students, who will also have higher IQs than those who don't attend college, will, due to conformity bias, tend towards political liberalism. The correlation between high IQ and political liberalism then is explained, at least in part, I think, by prestige and conformity bias, not by intelligence or careful attention to the arguments. Even if there's a correlation between high IQ and unbelief, we haven't learned that intelligence or rational assessment of arguments mediated or even contributed to anyone's unbelief. Unbelief could be the result of such unconscious belief drivers as the relief of existential anxieties or conformity bias. If religious belief is culturally recurrent, natural, and intuitive, and this is what cognitive science of religion shows, by the way, that religious belief is culturally recurrent, natural, and intuitive, and by that I mean non-inferential, then we should expect unbelief to be relatively rare, non-natural, and inferential. Recent studies have shown a correlation between inferential thinking and unbelief. Consider the ABC News headline on their story, religious faithfuls lack logic, study implies. Nicholas Epley claims that religious belief is more of a feeling than a thought. Faith is a matter of heart, unbelief of mind. In Scientific American, we read how critical thinkers lose their faith in God. Well, theists presumably are uncritical thinkers. Rob Brooks, Ciência professor of evolutionary ecology in Australia, claims that it is becoming clear that religion is in some senses the opposite of rational thinking. Do such studies show, as their headlines assert, that atheists are rational, but theists are not? Do they demonstrate the rational superiority of atheism over theism? Atheism is indeed relatively rare. Only about 2.4% of American adults identify as atheists. 7% of these are men, by the way. I write more on that in another chapter. A 2012 WIN Gallup poll puts the figure worldwide at 13%. Prior to the 20th century, the figure would have been likely near 0. How about the normality of atheism? If, as cognitive science or religion suggests, belief in God is as natural as enjoying music, then atheism seems as abnormal as hating music. But it's hard to know if this or that belief is normal or abnormal without having some sense of what it means for a belief to be normal. Let's move into an understanding of normal by way of analogy. Religion is normal in the same way that language is normal. Humans have the inborn capacity to naturally and normally develop a language as babies mature if they are in the right sorts of environment. Beings raised by wolves in a forest is not the optimal setting for language acquisition. And being raised in a human community anywhere in the world is. That's the place where people learn languages. Give a child time, and her inborn cognitive dispositions, those involved in language acquisition and formation, will issue forth in fluent Chinese, say, or Turkish. She won't decide to acquire a language. Native language acquisition will happen naturally and normally with little or no conscious effort on her part. Likewise, we are cognitively disposed as we mature to acquire religious beliefs, the religious beliefs of our family or culture, with little or no cognitive effort on our part. They just arise naturally and normally. While we are cognitively disposed to religious beliefs and practices, which religious beliefs and practices one acquires depends almost entirely on one's culture. Religion, like language, is natural and normal. It is an easy, straightforward, unconsciously acquired expression of universal cognitive faculties in the right environment. Unbelief in this sense is not so natural or normal. And by this sense, I mean a statistical sense, or at least not so clearly natural or normal. Of course, if one grows up in a community that lacks typical religious promptings, one's natural dispositions to religious belief are not likely to be appropriately stimulated. And thus one is not likely to acquire religious beliefs and practices. The Swedish child of a Swedish atheist who grows up in Sweden is likely to naturally be a non-theist. Naturally occurring religious beliefs require a religiously infused environment to flourish, just as the natural acquisition of the Swedish language requires the right sort of environment to flourish. Even if religious belief were natural and normal and unbelief unnatural and abnormal, there's nothing special about a belief's being natural or normal. A belief's being natural or normal is neither a virtue nor a vice. A natural and normal belief can be rational or irrational, true or false, a brain fart, or a revelation. For example, an entomologist who is fully aware that only about a dozen of the tens of thousands of species of spiders are poisonous might still have a natural, but for her, given her awareness of the data, irrational fear of spiders. On the other hand, I might naturally and rationally believe that I'm better than average. And by the way, this is something that each of us is naturally disposed to believe. And it might even, in some sense or other, be true. However, once I've been made aware that all humans have this cognitive disposition and rightly judged that we can't all be better than average, then my belief would be irrational. But if I were unaware of this cognitive disposition and unaware that we can't all be right in making such judgments, then my belief would be, as far as I can tell, rational. I could multiply examples. What makes belief rational or irrational or true or false has nothing to do with their being natural or normal. Nonetheless, some beliefs, the natural and normal ones, arise rather easily and without conscious reflection in virtually everyone due to our cognitive constitutions given the right sorts of stimulation, like language or folk physics. Consider an analogy with folk physics, which, like religious belief, is culturally recurrent, natural, and intuitive. Folk or naive physics is our normal, natural, unreflective, perceptual understanding of the physical world. Folk physics might include simple and true generalizations such as dropped rocks fall to the ground or rocks thrown hard enough through windows will break them. But it also includes common sense statements that run contrary to contemporary physics, which postulates a host of unobservable entities such as atoms and photons, and may even hold that our natural notions of past and future are illusory. The movement from folk physics to contemporary physics required an enormous amount of inferential effort sufficient to override at least some of our deep and natural and normal intuitions. Contemporary physics requiring abstract thinking and complicated mathematics is deeply counterintuitive and contrary to what we observe. Belief in contemporary physics, then, requires inferential thinking. Likewise, the rejection of our very natural and normal religious beliefs may involve inferential thinking. Some atheists are what Gervais and Norton call mind blind, seen in individuals who lack the ability to mind read, that is, to process or cognize other minds. Such individuals are usually high on the autism spectrum. The higher one is on the autism spectrum, that is, the less one is able to cognize persons or other minds, the less likely one is to believe in a personal God. If theistic beliefs involve belief in a divine person, those who lack the ability to cognize persons, the mind blind, are likewise likely to lack belief in a divine person. Philosophers know, or should know, that cause is really hard to prove and that correlations may evince an underlying shared cause. So perhaps the relationship of inferential thinking, even high IQs, to unbelief is not the relation of cause to effect. Perhaps both are mediated by a common underlying cause. I've already suggested several common causes of this correlation: conformity and prestige bias. Let us, in this section, consider one more: autism. In this section, I will explore features of autism as possibly mediating both atheism and inferential thinking and high IQ. I will present studies which suggest that the connection between atheism and inferential thinking is mediated by mentalizing constraints, mind blindness, commonly found in autistic individuals. Recent studies have shown that atheism and agnosticism are, in some cases, both correlated and mediated by a mentalizing constraint. Mind blindness that is common to individuals on the autism spectrum If God is a non-physical mind, then those with mind blindness should be expected to manifest higher degrees of unbelief in a personal God, and again, in some cases, atheism. The work of Catherine Caldwell Harris and colleagues first called attention to the correlation between high-functioning autistic individuals and atheism. Their research suggested that individuals with high-functioning autism are predisposed towards unbelief. Norenzayan, Gervais, and Treniewski argued that the mentalizing characteristics of HFA individuals incline them towards atheism. While they replicated the Caldwell-Harris study that those higher on autism scales are less likely to believe in a personal God, they were able to isolate and then eliminate other cognitive faculties or tendencies that might mediate or incline one towards atheism. The first part of the Caldwell-Harris study involved a content analysis of blog posts on religion and philosophy in websites for high-functioning autistic individuals and for non-high-functioning autistic individuals, neurotypical individuals. Posts were coded for content analysis, and individuals were assigned to various religious belief categories, including, for example, agnostic, atheist, and Christian. Participants with high-functioning autism were significantly less likely to code for theistic beliefs and significantly more likely to code for atheism and agnosticism. For example, while about 37% of the neurotypical population coded for Christianity, less than 17% of the high-functioning autism population did. HFA discussants were 50% more likely to identify as atheists and 70% more likely to identify as agnostics. A second study involved an internet. I think I'm going to skip the second study. I'll go to the next paragraph. Norenzayan, 2012. Norenzayan 2012 study thought to isolate mentalizing deficits as the mediator of unbelief. Based on scores on the autism spectrum quotient self-report questionnaire, Norenzayan and colleagues claimed that mentalizing deficits mediated increased tendencies towards atheism and agnosticism. Again, if God is personal, then a typically functioning theory of mind score seems associated to belief in God as an intentional agent. Mentalizing deficits, therefore, seem a likely contributor to unbelief. I'm going to skip that quote and go to the next paragraph. If Caldwell-Harris and Norenzayan are correct, atheism's mediation by autism provide an explanation of the correlation between atheism on the one hand and high IQ and inferential thinking styles on the other. Since autistic individuals have typically, on average, higher IQ and more inferential thinking styles than non-autistic individuals, autism provides the common ground between atheism, again on the one hand, and high IQ and inferential thinking on the other. In a sufficient number of cases to explain the differences, atheism and inferential thinking may be mediated by autism, rather than atheism being mediated by inferential thinking or careful reflection on the evidence. Given the relatively slight differences between believers and unbelievers, a more careful analysis of the data correlating unbelief on the one hand and high IQ and inferential thinking on the other may be explainable entirely by the presence of individuals who fall on the autism spectrum, whether diagnosable as autistic or not in the relevant studies. Finally, autism is correlated with being both an academic and a scientist. I'm guessing some of you have professors who are high on the autism spectrum. I see some heads nodding. As a group, women are the least likely to suffer from autism, while men are 4 to 5 times more likely than women to have autism. Professors as a group are more likely to be autistic than men as a group. And scientists are even more likely, with physicists and mathematicians at the top of the autism spectrum on average. This scale intuitively maps onto religious sensibilities. Women as a group are considerably more likely to be religious than men than professors, and professors than scientists. So the same, the map of unbelief matches onto the graph of unbelief matches onto the graph of the autism spectrum. If this mapping is correct, autism would partially explain the atheism agnosticism we find in the academy and among scientists. All right, let me conclude. The claim that atheists are smarter, more attentive to arguments, and hence more rational than theists has not survived rational scrutiny. Atheists may have higher IQs and more inferential thinking styles than theists, but that does not make them smarter or more rational. Indeed, high IQ, inferential thinking, and atheism may share some non-truth conducive common causes. Since high IQs cluster around universities, the prestige and conformity biases that shape universities explain some of the preponderance of atheism in universities. Since higher IQs are correlated with higher education, relief of existential anxiety that accompanies the wealth associated with countries that afford educational opportunities to its citizens. That is, wealth both causes high IQs and relieves the existential anxieties that undergird some religious beliefs. Finally, autism is highly correlated with both atheism and agnosticism on the one hand, and high IQ and inferential thinking on the other. Both are mediated by the autistic individual's mentalizing deficits. In short, while some people surely reject God's existence after careful consideration of the arguments, unbelief can be counted for in many cases with just the sorts of psychological biases that some attribute to theists. It's complicated, of course, but this much we know: atheism and agnosticism are associated with the same sorts of psychological biases atheists attribute to theists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this talk. I think that we have lots of questions to think about after your contribution. Muito bem, então nós temos agora um tempo para um diálogo, não é, com o professor. Eu vou só acionar aqui o meu chat, porque também tem questões que vêm do chat.
Let's put our iPhones away.
Huh?
Let's put our iPhones away.
Ah, ok. Ah, ok.
You can have your iPhone.
Muito bem, amigos. Então, nós podemos iniciar, não é, esse momento de debate, de conversa, não é, com o professor, e a palavra está aberta. Então, aqueles que preferirem fazer questões por escrito, né, podem redigir uma questão, trazer aqui à mesa. Aqueles que desejarem fazer a questão assim, falando, né, brevemente, podem fazer também a questão e a gente vai traduzir para o professor, tá bem? Então eu vou começar esse... I will start for questions. I mean, you told that faith or belief can be true or false. And that's not the question of the paper. That's not the question of the paper. But could you speak more about that, just to enlighten people about the difference of normal or abnormal and false and true? Because perhaps it can be a question. I suppose when I was reading the paper, little by little I understood that this wasn't the question, but I was looking for this, reading the paper. So
I'll just say, many people think that I wasn't really talking about faith very much. I was just talking about belief in God. And that belief in God is widely shared historically and throughout the world. And with respect to these studies, I think God exists myself, but God might not. But finding out that it's widespread doesn't prove that God exists. It doesn't disprove that God exists.
Eu vou explicar a minha questão primeiro. A minha questão era, o professor fala na palestra dele, né, que a questão dele é se a crença ou não crença, né, crença em Deus, né, não propriamente fé, mas a crença em Deus ou não crença, né, é ou não racional, né? Mas eu perguntei para ele se ele poderia também falar um pouquinho sobre um tópico que ele tocou assim en passant, né, de passagem, que é sobre a verdade ou falsidade da fé. Então ele começou respondendo justamente que o tópico dele, né, não é esse. Eu perguntei para fazer uma espécie de contraste, né, para ficar mais claro o tópico dele, né? Que o tópico dele não é propriamente a fé, mas a crença ou não crença, né, descrença em Deus, que é algo culturalmente, historicamente constante na história da humanidade.
And I just want to say, when we're talking about the cognitive science of religion, it involves evolutionary psychology, it involves anthropology, and I think you need to understand that throughout human history, Christian faith is really recent. And by and large, it's not trying to understand Christianity, it's trying to understand all of religious beliefs for humans of the past 400,000 years. Well, Christianity's only been around 2,000 of those 4,000 years. And then a relatively small number of all the people that have ever existed in the world are Christians. So cognitive science or religion isn't really taking Christianity as their data. They're just taking belief in God from the earliest of humans that we have evidence for up to now. And that is that human beings roughly believe that there's a power higher than them. The power is usually a person. The power is good. Sometimes it's bad. I mean, there are cultures that believe in bad gods, and the power usually has some sort of authority over human beings. So that if you do bad things, you get punished. If you do good things, you get rewarded. And that's roughly the very general belief in God that they're primarily dealing with.
Então, a psicologia cognitiva, a antropologia, não é? Não lidam apenas com a fé cristã. A fé cristã é recente, tem 2000 anos, né? Enquanto a crença em Deus é algo muito antigo na humanidade, não é? Que tem milhares e milhares de anos. Então, a fé cristã é uma parcela relativamente pequena, né, em relação a toda a população do mundo, né? Não sei, 1/5 da população do mundo, enquanto a crença em Deus é algo muito mais abrangente, né, e espalhado. Então, essa crença em Deus tem algumas características básicas, né? Então, a gente basicamente crê num Deus bondoso, ele pode ser mau também, mas basicamente é a crença universal, né, numa divindade, num poder em algo que é bondoso, né? E que, por assim dizer, também repercute na nossa vida segundo o bem e o mal que nós fazemos e vivemos. Thank you. Outras questões? Deixa eu ver.
I would like to put some questions. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you for the talk. It is always great to hear you and read your papers. Thank you. I'm not quite sure if I get everything right, but I will do my questions anyway. So far I understand you made three big points that I will put in the following way. First, bigger wealth, lower belief in God. First point. Second point, bigger grade in academic, lower belief in God. And third point, bigger a person is in the autism spectrum, lower belief in God. 3 points that together show that the atheist perhaps is a belief not formed by true tracking process. Yeah. So I understood your paper. First, in relation to the first point, I'm not quite sure if it's always the case that bigger wealth, lower belief in God. I've heard from some research that shows the contrary. Yep. This research is realized in Brazilian communities, favelas, and shows that people with lower income are less prone to believe in God than people with the higher incomes that live in the neighborhoods from the favela. It's amazing, very surprising, but such a research exists. Okay. That's one point, and so I will go on. Que eu sugeri para ele que eu entendi o texto colocando 3 pontos principais que eu coloquei como 3 hipóteses. A primeira, quanto maior o bem-estar social, menor a crença na divindade. Segundo ponto, quanto maior a pressão por conformidade, isso vale particularmente para o universo acadêmico, menor a crença em Deus. E o terceiro ponto, quanto maior uma pessoa está no aspecto autista, menor a sua crença na divindade. Então, esses 3 pontos que, na minha opinião, formaram a espinha dorsal do texto do professor Clark. Em relação ao primeiro ponto, eu perguntei, quer dizer, eu disse a ele que há uma pesquisa realizada, na verdade, uma pesquisa realizada por um professor aqui de Belo Horizonte, que é o Flávio Senra, da Católica, que mostra que em algumas comunidades aqui da nossa cidade, particularmente na comunidade de Santa Lúcia, as pessoas são menos dispostas a acreditar em Deus do que as pessoas que moram ao redor da comunidade, no bairro de São Bento, Santa Lúcia, que são os bairros de pessoas ricas, não é? E que isso é surpreendente. Eu comentei isso com ele.
Can I respond to the first question while I...
Yeah.
Okay. While I remember. I noted an exception in my paper. These are statistical generalizations. They're not hardcore laws of sociology or physics. So there will be exceptions. And I noted the greatest one in my paper is the United States. As it's increased in material wealth, religious belief didn't decline the way it did in Europe and especially Scandinavian countries. There probably are sociological explanations for that. Europe and Scandinavian countries have all have state churches. So it doesn't matter who goes, they get money from the state. And I think a lot of the, in America, the church is separate, gets zero money from the state. So it has to have people. And so what the churches have done in the United States is it's like a market. They've made themselves more attractive. And the European churches are often extremely dull because there's no motivation for them to attract people. So nothing that I've said means that everything happens inevitably the way this goes. They're just statistical generalizations, and there will be exceptions. And the one you say is really interesting. Like I want to look into it and see what anthropologists and sociologists are saying about why religious belief is declining among poor people in Brazil and increasing among wealthy people. I would love to see why that is happening, but again, I'm just talking about statistical generalizations to which there will be sometimes really notable exceptions. Thanks.
Então, o professor está dizendo que em relação a essas pessoas, não é, mais ricas ou mais pobres e a crença em Deus, não é, entre as pessoas mais ricas, não é, e a dúvida, não é, a descrença em Deus, a descrença em Deus entre as pessoas mais ricas e a crença em Deus entre as pessoas mais pobres, né, é uma generalização estatística, quer dizer, não é uma prova cabal absoluta, né, e que ele está tomando em consideração, sobretudo, o contexto norte-americano, escandinavo, né, do norte da Europa, e que ele ficou realmente interessado, né, nessa pesquisa citada aqui pelo professor Sérgio, sobre essa possível inversão, né, da descrença nos meios pobres e da elevação da crença nos meios ricos. Quer continuar, professor? Sim.
Second question. In fact, I have a lot of questions, but I will put this second one. It's very simple. I don't know if we have a problem because it seems to me to be a tension between the second point and third point, because I'm not quite sure if a person, autistic person, is prone to accept conformity, social pressure, and so on. I don't know if that is a problem, whether that's a problem.
Autistic individuals are... Oh, say, go ahead.
Eu vou traduzir. Em relação a esses 3 pontos, né, eu sugeri que talvez houvesse uma tensão entre o terceiro e o segundo, visto que uma pessoa autista ela não estaria inclinada a ceder à pressão por conformidade. Não é? Eu perguntei para ele se isso seria algo problemático no pensamento.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure the question, but I will just say this. Autistic individuals are way less susceptible to conformity bias because they don't know what's expected. Like they can't read, they don't know, they don't understand what's expected. And it's why because they can't tell what you're thinking or feeling, their responses are often inappropriate. It's not the case that most autistic individuals want to be left alone. They don't. It's that they have been in so many social situations where they've gone wrong. They feel like they don't fit. And so they often are alone. but they're not liable to conformity bias because they don't know what you think is the standard of beauty or the standard of cool. They can't detect that because they're not good at reading social cues.
Então, explicando bem a questão dos autistas, não é que eles não querem, não têm o desejo, a vontade de interagir socialmente, mas é que nas interações sociais, como há um problema em relação a detectar, intenções, sentimentos, muitas vezes essas relações sociais não dão certo, quer dizer, há um processo de quebra, por assim dizer. Então, é nesse sentido que há esse maior isolamento dos autistas. Tá certo a tradução? Você colocaria mais alguma coisa?
Let me just say,
a minha tradução estava certa? Tá bom? Ok.
I want to add one thing. You shouldn't think that because there's a statistical correlation between autism and unbelief that all autistic individuals are not believers. There's a whole panoply of religious beliefs on the part of autistic individuals. And if you paid careful enough attention to my paper, you'll see that in the Caldwell-Harris paper, a pretty high percentage of autistic individuals identified as Christians. So I wrote a paper with a psychologist who specializes in religion in autistic individuals, and ours was the panoply. I think it was called the panoply of religious practices or something like that among autistic individuals. And we try to just show how widely varied autistic individuals are. Some of them, and it's easier if they're lower on the autism spectrum, some of them have beliefs probably close to some of you about a personal God. Others, they have beliefs that fit their cognition, I guess is the best way to look at it. So autistic individuals, on average, tend to be systemizers. So they like things to fit into a rational system. I think a lot of high-level theoretical physicists are systemizers. I think they're autistic individuals that can look out into the world and put things in order in ways none of the rest of us can. They're autistic individuals that memorize all of the train schedules for all of England. And so all of that is in order for them. That's some order they have in their lives. They're not all like that. Nothing that I've said about anybody in any group is universally true. People are in groups, but we shouldn't judge them based on the group. In my paper, I'm just trying to show that unbelief is way more psychologically complicated than these studies show. And I think it would be a mistake. Like, I think I've met Richard Dawkins. He wrote The God Delusion, and he took these psychological studies, and he said, oh, we know that religious believers are deluded. We know that they're psychologically defective. And if I were Richard Dawkins, I would say, we know that atheists are deluded and they're psychologically defective. And I think that's not right. I don't think he was right. Really, the book that this paper came from is an anti-Richard Dawkins book. And one thing I had to do over and over and over again is not be like Richard Dawkins. I had to be better than Richard Dawkins in not drawing inferences that don't follow from the data. And it does not follow from the psychological data and the cognitive psychology of religion that religious believers are deluded or crazy or irrational. But that's what he says. All those headlines said it. All those people said it. And I did not say that of atheists. And I don't think it should be said. And I have a provocative title, Are Atheists Normal? I didn't say they're not normal. I said they're not normal in some statistical sense, but who cares? They're just out of the average. And normal comes in a lot of shapes and sizes. It can be, You can have normal and natural belief. You can have normal and natural unbelief. But as religious believers, I think we need to look. We need people like you who are looking at these secularizing trends and claims and headlines and studies, and then dig deep and see what's really going on here. Never trust a headline. That's one thing. Then go and look at the study itself, and then say, can I trust the study itself? And then learn to ask questions about these studies. It took me 10 years to sort of work through all this. You're not going to go out tomorrow and start becoming a really good critic of socio-psychological studies. But give yourself, but I hope some of you are inspired to do it, and then go out and do it.
Ok. Então, professor, não, eu vou resumir um pouquinho. Então, o professor estava dizendo o seguinte, que em relação ao autismo, né, ele não está afirmando que há um determinismo que leva, né, os autistas à descrença. Né? Há autistas que creem. E o que ele está dizendo, né, e nem que os autistas são menos, né? Os autistas são, normalmente, há muitos gênios autistas capazes de organizar, né, e tem uma memória incrível e um senso de organização absurdo. Né? Então, o que ele está dizendo no paper dele, né, aqui no talk, na palestra, é, sobretudo, que abordagens como a de Richard Dawkins, né, que afirma, a partir de conclusões científicas, né, afirmaria, né, que, olha aí, tá vendo? Os que acreditam em Deus são pessoas que não são normais, são pessoas menos inteligentes, são pessoas menos espertas, são pessoas que utilizam menos o raciocínio inferencial e assim por diante. Né? Então, ele não quer dizer o contrário. Não. Quem é menos esperto, quem é menos inferencial, são os que não creem em Deus. Né? Ele apenas quer demonstrar, né, que as razões para não crer em Deus, né, ou as causas para não crer em Deus, muitas vezes não são racionais. Né? Então, a finalidade do paper dele é sair dessa espécie de guerra. Né? Ou seja, os que acreditam em Deus são mais inteligentes do que os que não acreditam, ou os que não acreditam em Deus são mais inteligentes do que os que acreditam. Né? Ele está só mostrando, né, que pode ter outras causas da descrença em Deus. E essas causas da descrença em Deus não desabilitam, nem, digamos, desvalorizam aquelas pessoas que não acreditam em Deus. Né? São justamente fatores que levam a crer ou não crer em Deus. Bem, então nós temos algumas perguntas escritas. O Marco Heleno tem duas, ele vai traduzir para nós, né, Marco?
A primeira pergunta é: o fato de acreditar ou não em Deus não poderia ser transferido por acreditar ou não na ciência? Não poderíamos transferir atributos divinos à ciência, à razão, transformando a ciência como um Deus ou figura divina? So, Professor Kelly, the question is, the fact of believing or not in God could not be transformed into believing or not in science. Couldn't it happen that we transfer divine attributes to science, reason, transforming science in a God or divine figure? This is the first question. A segunda é, supondo the question is about if you cannot exchange religious values from God to science and reason. You transform science in a new God.
So I'll just quickly, so that's an issue that I look at, and I look at whether science can do things that have traditionally been attributed to God. And I'll just take one example. I think morality has something to do with God. I don't know what exactly it has to do with God, but I think there's no good scientific explanation, or let's put it this way, there's no good scientific grounding of morality. And so I have a chapter on the evolution of morality, and some people think you can ground morality in evolution, and I that just doesn't work, and I have an argument against that. So science can do some great things. I love science. I'm working with science here, but it's not a God replacement, and there are losses for people that give up belief in God and think that science is the new God and can do everything. The science can't. It can do lots of things. God bless science, but it can't replace God.
Então, em relação à possibilidade da ciência substituir a crença em Deus, não é? Então, o professor estava dizendo que ele não vê isso, não é, como uma possibilidade para o cientista. Não é claro que para muitas pessoas talvez haja, não é? For the scientific, it's not the case, but perhaps for people who read about science, they could believe in science. I mean,
well, everybody believes.
Yes,
anyone can believe in anything.
That's it.
So I have nothing against that, but and they can believe, and many people believe, including some really good philosophers, that science or evolution can ground morality.
É isso.
They're just wrong.
Então, ele deu o exemplo, né, de que a moralidade, né, a moral não pode ser apoiada ou fundada sobre ciência. Ciência não fundamenta a moral, né? Então, bom, eu estou trabalhando com uma cientista, uma bióloga agora, né, e foi justamente isso que ela me disse, né, que faz falta, né, para os cientistas uma fundamentação moral mais apurada, né? Então, a ciência faz coisas maravilhosas, né? Deus abençoe a ciência, como ele disse, mas não é o caso, né, de que a ciência poderia substituir a crença em Deus.
A segunda questão é, supondo que os ateus atribuem racionalidade às suas crenças ou descrenças, como eles poderiam estar epistemicamente justificados acerca disso? Kelly, the question is, supposing that atheists attribute rationality to their beliefs or unbeliefs, how could they be epistemically justified about that?
So they could be epistemically justified if they base their unbelief on good reasons. They could also be rational, I think, if, for example, if their parents are atheists and they didn't have religious stimulations, it's perfectly rational for children to believe what their parents tell them. And we might not. So anyway, it's a perfectly rational belief-producing mechanism to believe what people you respect tell you. So an atheist could be rational just by virtue of believing what their parents tell them. And they could also be rational if they looked at the problem of evil, for example, and couldn't see how a good God could create a world with so much evil. Or they could back out of their driveway and run over their infant daughter and kill them and stop believing instantly without reflecting on the problem of evil. There are all sorts of ways I think an atheist could be epistemically justified, usually in exactly the same ways that a theist could be epistemically justified. There are all sorts of different cognitive faculties and ways people come to belief, which I think are perfectly fine. My own view is that most people are rational most of the time. We don't like that. We like to think that people who disagree with us are irrational and maybe even immoral, and in some cases crazy. Like I have to fight thinking that people that vote for Trump aren't irrational or immoral or crazy. But I think they came to their belief in values Trump represents in exactly the same way that I came to my beliefs and values. I just think that's the human situation.
Bem, então, em relação às causas, né, como haveria causas, né, para uma descrença, causas racionais, então o professor disse que sim, né? Então, quer dizer, uma pessoa seria, né, seria um descrente ou unbelief racional, né, caso baseasse, né, a sua descrença em razões, né, ou seja, que viessem, por exemplo, de inferências. Então, ele dá um exemplo de inferência ou de evidência, né? Por exemplo, ele fala do problema do mal, né? Como um Deus bom pode criar um universo mal, uma pessoa pode honestamente, não compreender, como isso pode ser o caso, ou uma pessoa pode ser ateia porque ela vem de uma família em que o ateísmo é o caso, e ela é educada como ateia, ou uma pessoa pode ser ateia porque, por exemplo, acontece uma tragédia na sua família, seu filho morre assim instantaneamente diante dele. Então, há muitas razões que podem levar uma pessoa ao ateísmo, assim como há muitas razões que podem levar uma pessoa à crença em Deus. O que o professor Kelly quer dizer é que uma pessoa não é imoral, nem menos humana porque não acredita em Deus. Assim como também uma pessoa não é imoral ou menos humana porque votou em Trump. Aqui nós temos o caso do Bolsonaro. Here we have Bolsonaro. Então, algumas pessoas tenderiam a dizer, fulano votou nesse candidato, então ele não pensa, ele é imoral, ele é irracional. Então o professor está dizendo que não, que ele chegou a essa conclusão a partir das suas razões, dos seus valores morais, e fez a sua opção. Então a gente tem que estar disposto, numa sociedade, a aceitar essa, digamos, esse limitado processo no qual cada um está inserido, nós também, e no qual nós chegamos às nossas conclusões. Podemos também mudar, de acordo com outras eventualidades. Vamos ver como é que nós estamos. We have 7 minutes. So
let me just say one more thing related to that. One thing that's cognitive psychologists has really clearly shown is that almost all of our beliefs are produced immediately and often by biases, and some biases are positive, some are negative. And what we do is if someone asks us, then we think up the reason for it. But the reason almost always comes later. We're what are called ex post facto rationalizers. And so we have beliefs caused by a whole bunch of things. If challenged, we give a reason for it. And then we say the reason is why we believe that. But there are countless cases where they can show that the reason isn't why you believe. Why you believe was some immediate cause by some psychological bias. But we, atheists and theists alike, when we're pressed, will offer a reason and then say the reason is why we believe. And it just isn't true.
Então, a psicologia cognitiva da religião tem demonstrado, nos seus resultados, que a crença ela não advém de um argumento racional. Normalmente, a nossa crença advém de nossos vieses, ou de nossa cultura, ou de nossos sentimentos, Agora, quando alguém é perguntado por que crê, então aí ele é capaz de dar razões. Então a razão vem depois, né? A racionalização vem depois. Isso é bastante interessante, essa forma, não é, de pensamento. Obrigado.
Okay, we have here a lot of questions, but let me put some. Okay. First, what kind of role plays the feeling in belief in God? What kind of role feeling in belief in God? And second, if suffering is a way, a path to believe in Christian God, these are the two questions. Sofrimentos, perdão. A segunda questão foi sobre se o sofrimento seria um caminho para a crença em Deus.
Então, sobre os sentimentos, né? Qual o papel dos sentimentos na crença e qual o papel do sofrimento na crença?
So I'll take the feeling question first, and maybe there won't be time for the suffering one. So the thing about emotions is, and the way the question is asked makes me think that you think that there's a divide between emotion and thought, or emotion and judgment, that you're moved by a feeling or you're moved by a thought. And it turns out emotions have a cognitive element. And I'll just give you an example. I can't remember the guy's name, but in the 19th century, there was a railroad worker that there was an explosion, and this shaft came and pierced his brain and cut off the feeling part of his brain. Phineas Gage is his name, and it's famous. You can read about it in all sorts of places. And because he lacked feelings, he could cognize, like he could add and subtract, for example, or he could say, if I do this, this will happen. If I do this, this will happen. But he couldn't act because feelings need to be are connected with our thoughts that move us to act and to believe. So pretty much all of our beliefs are emotion involved. All of our emotions are belief involved, judgment involved. And my guess is if the feeling part of your brain got cut off, it could really change what you believe about God. And it might change what value you see that there is in the world. And you have to value something to move. You can see what all the consequences are, but you have to want the consequences to move. And our emotions are involved in that wanting. So I had a student one time who was in an automobile accident. The car hit her, and her head hit on the windshield. And she flew off. So you couldn't see any injuries, but something happened to her brain. And she woke up as a 5-year-old, emotionally a 5-year-old, and she didn't believe in God anymore. She got her head hit, and where it hit her head, the emotion part of her brain, it changed everything she believed. So I don't make a big distinction between emotion and thought. I think we're big thought emotion. I think emotions have a cognitive element and thoughts have an emotional element. And there's a lot of really rich and wonderful literature on this topic. if someone wants to pursue it. But and it would be a good topic to pursue because it has so many implications for thinking about belief in God and unbelief. And anyway, I wouldn't make a I don't like to make a distinction.
Então, em relação aos sentimentos, não é, e as emoções, o professor estava lembrando, não é, casos em que pessoas têm acidentes cerebrais e que perdem, por assim dizer, sua capacidade de emocionar-se, né, sua capacidade de sentimento, se tornam altamente lógicas, né? Se eu faço isso, acontece aquilo, se A, então B, não é? Mas elas não conseguem agir, não é? E outros casos em que essas pessoas justamente regridem, não é, a uma idade mental infantil e, como consequência desse acidente, não creem mais em Deus, não é? Então isso mostra que emoções e pensamentos, não é, estão intimamente ligados, não é? Quer dizer, provavelmente todas as nossas crenças são também crenças com sentimentos, crenças que também são despertadas por emoções, né? Não simplesmente por pensamentos. Bom, nós estamos chegando ao fim. Tem uma questão aqui que chegou no chat, e só para não desprezar o chat, né? A gente não vai poder ler todas as questões, né? Depois até a gente pode passar para o professor algumas e conversar com eles e dar um feedback para vocês, tá? Mas tem uma questão aqui no chat que é a seguinte: How can I explain Christ to my autistic son? Uma pessoa que... Christ to my autistic son. Então, uma pessoa que tem um filho autista está assistindo a palestra e perguntou como é que ela pode falar do Cristo para o filho dela que é autista.
That's a great question, and if you want to send me an email, I might be able to send some resources. I don't know how old your son is or how high up on the autism spectrum, but you're not alone. I know many people who, or have read of, many people who have autistic children who are autistic individuals. And it's hard if you're a serious religious believer. It's hard. It's hard even if you're not. It can be hard raising an autistic child. And so there's a couple books I'd recommend by autistic individuals who are religious believers. And one of them, the one I like the most, is by a woman who's a professor, of course, she's way high in the autism spectrum. And I'll just give an example. She grew up in a church, and she likes the ritual. So she's a systemizer. She likes the ritual. She has to go to a church where somebody tells her what to do, and she hates going to churches where they stop and the minister or pastor or priest says, "Now everyone talk to each other," because that she can't handle. Everything has to be structured. This is for her. I don't know if this is for you or for your son. Every autistic individual is different. And she also, as she got older, she has a side effect. There's the most common problem, cognitive defect for autistic individuals is mind blindness, but there are lots of other defects that they experience, and she can't tolerate loud noise or bright light. So she has to be in an old church building that has, either almost no windows or the windows are all colored. She can't be in a place with bright light. She's highly sensitive to bright light, and she's highly sensitive to noise. It really pains her to hear loud noises, so she doesn't like to be in churches where people sing loudly, or she'll sit in the back so she doesn't have to hear it. Anyway, her religious belief is one that, and it's hard for her to believe in a personal God. So she views God as like the perfect equation that explains everything. She's a systemizer, personal belief. Anyway, people can find ways to express their religious beliefs within their cognitive life. And a tragedy happened to her one time. She swam in a bath of chemicals. She worked with animals, and she was trying to prove that the chemicals were safe, and they weren't. So she swam in a bath of chemicals, and the chemicals, she breathed them in, had a really dramatic effect on her brain. And she came out of that with no religious feelings whatsoever. She had some religious feelings before and came out after with none. And then it was hard for her to be religious in her, or be Christian in her way. And she wrote an autobiography. Temple Grandin is her name. You can find, she's given TED Talks. She's probably the most famous autistic individual in the world. Anyway, autistic individuals can be and are Christians. They're religious, but it may not be the way you are. You're not going to make them neurotypical. And I have no answer for you because I don't know your child. And if I could say anything not to take away from this, it's this: don't think of any individual as a member of a group. Don't take the thing that's statistically common with respect to a group and think the individual's like that. Individuals are individuals. You have to think of them as individuals. So don't think of atheists as irrational, defective, abnormal. Don't think of atheists as members of a group. They're as diverse as Christians are. And you should treat them the way you would like them to treat you, which I think Jesus said. So I think I'll just stop on that.
Então, há muitos casos, né, de pessoas autistas, né, que são crentes, acreditam no Cristo, não é? Mas o professor estava dizendo, assim, resumindo, né, que a gente não consegue, quer dizer, que não é um bom caminho, no caso, né, da pergunta da pessoa que tem um filho autista, né, e quer falar do Cristo para ela, de colocar esse filho num grupo. Não, meu filho é autista, então eu tenho que fazer de determinada forma, né? Então ele deu alguns exemplos, né? Um exemplo de uma professora que é autista e é uma sistematizadora, né? Systemizer, e ela tem uma fé em Deus a partir, né, de uma visão do cosmos, né, como um sistema organizado. Então ela acredita em Deus, né, a partir dessa experiência que ela tem de sistematizar como cientista o cosmos, né? E depois ele deu um outro exemplo interessante, não é, de uma criança ou jovem, não é, que não suporta som alto e muita luz, né? Então ela vai à igreja e ela adora a igreja por causa do rito e porque quer dizer, o ritual é bastante marcado e previsível, vamos dizer assim, não é? E os cantos são suaves e não tem muita luz. Agora, se o padre resolver dizer assim, bom, agora vamos conversar uns com os outros, né? Então ela fica perdida, vai detestar isso porque ela não sabe lidar com esse tipo de coisa. Então a conclusão dele é que o importante, não é sondar essa pessoa, não é, e não colocá-la num grupo para descobrir como transmitir a fé a essa pessoa em particular. Muito bem, então vamos dar uma salva de palmas aqui para o professor mais uma vez. Agradeço a todos, não é? E essa palestra está no nosso canal do YouTube, vocês podem rever. E eu peço a vocês também que, se vocês gostaram, né, transmitam essa palestra para outras pessoas dos seus contatos, certo? Um grande abraço. Thank you very much, Kelly.